There is a stretch in personal finance that almost nobody talks about, honestly. It is the stretch where you are no longer starting from zero.
You have saved something real. You have a balance that actually looks like progress, and yet your money still acts like it cannot help you. You check the account. The number is bigger than it has ever been, but the month still feels ordinary. The relief you were expecting did not arrive.
And somewhere in the back of your mind, you start wondering if something is wrong with you, or if the whole promise was oversold. It was not, but what you are feeling is real, and it has a name. This is the wealth plateau. It is the point where your income and savings finally become meaningful, but your habits, defaults, and financial rules have not caught up. So compounding stalls before it ever changes your life. Today, I want to show you why normal habits start working against you in this middle mile, and what actually has to change before that first serious balance starts behaving like the system it was supposed to become. If you stay on beginner autopilot too long, you can spend years at a respectable number without ever getting the freedom that number was supposed to buy. Let us start with the moment most people misunderstand completely. Picture a morning. You open your investment account, and for the first time, the number crosses a threshold that feels different. Maybe it is 100,000. Maybe it is 250. Whatever your personal version of real money is, you are finally looking at it, and almost nothing happens. There is no switch that flips, no sense of freedom unlocking. You still have to show up to work on Monday. You still check prices at the grocery store. The bills still arrive. This is not because the milestone was fake. It is because the milestone was never the finish line. It was the entrance to a different kind of problem. In the early stage, personal finance is simple. Earn more than you spend. Save the difference. Avoid disaster. The rules are brutal, but they are clear. You either make progress or you do not. And if you make progress, you assume the rules stay the same, just with bigger numbers. But they do not. There is a middle mile between finally have something and money actually helps. In that stretch, the old rules stop being enough. The habits that got you here start acting like friction, and the people who never update their operating system can sit at a respectable balance for a decade without ever feeling what that balance was supposed to buy them. Think about your neighbor. The one with the boring car. The one who never seems stressed about money, but also never seems to spend visibly. From the outside, his life does not look dramatically different from yours, but if you could see his spreadsheet, you would notice something strange. His numbers move differently than yours, not because he earns infinitely more, but because somewhere along the way, his operating system changed. The small decisions that you make on autopilot, the ones that feel neutral, are costing you lift that his version quietly captures. And that difference is almost impossible to see from the outside. Both of you go to work. Both of you have retirement accounts. Both of you pay your bills on time. The visible markers of responsible financial behavior are identical, but underneath, the machinery is running differently. His cash is not sitting idle. His debt payoff sequence is not based on emotion. His spending has guardrails that surface drift before it settles in. His income engine gets maintenance, not just extraction. None of this is complicated. None of it requires genius. It just requires recognizing that the middle mile is not more of the same. It is a transition that the beginner rules were never designed to handle. The wealth plateau is not about failing. It is about succeeding enough to reach the middle mile and then staying stuck there because beginner mode never turned off. Most people never realize they are in it. They just feel a vague sense that something is not working the way it was supposed to. In the beginning, autopilot is fine. You are building the habit of saving it all. You are getting off zero. The fine print does not matter because the principle is so small that the fine print has almost no effect. But once the balance is real, autopilot becomes expensive. Every month, there is a gap between what you earn and what you keep. In the early stage, that gap is the whole story. But in the middle mile, the gap should be widening,
and for a lot of people, it quietly stops. Here is what that looks like in practice. Cash sits in a checking account because you never set up anywhere better for it to go. Not a lot, just enough to feel comfortable. But comfort has a price. That cash is earning almost nothing, while the rest of your money is supposed to be compounding. And the drag shows up not in 1 month, but over years. 5 years of idle cash at a meaningful balance is a vacation you will never take. 10 years is a down payment you will need to earn twice. Delivery fees stack up because it is easier than going out. Subscriptions renew because you forgot they existed. Buy now, pay later quietly spreads purchases across weeks in a way that makes spending feel smaller than it is. Each one is trivial. Together, they form a constant background drain that most people never add up. And the thing about middle-mile money is that these drains have multipliers. In the early stage, a $20 monthly subscription is $20. In the middle mile, that $20 was supposed to be compounding. Over a decade, the actual cost is much higher than the face value. And when you have a dozen of these quiet leaks running simultaneously, each one too small to seem worth canceling, the total drag becomes serious. None of this is dramatic. None of it looks like failure. And that is exactly the problem. You are not going bankrupt. You are not making obvious mistakes. You are just running software that was designed for a smaller balance, and the inefficiency compounds quietly over time. And the worst part is baseline creep. You get a raise, finally some breathing room, but within a few months, your spending has quietly risen to match. Not because you made one big decision, but because 100 small ones added up. A slightly nicer dinner, a slightly faster delivery tier. A slightly easier version of your day. Each upgrade was reasonable in isolation. The problem is that they all happened, and none of them was tracked as a permanent increase in your baseline. So the raise absorbed, the gap stayed the same, the plateau stayed. This is not a character flaw. This is what happens when beginner autopilot keeps running in the middle mile. The habits that were invisible at $100 a month become very visible at $1,000. And by the time you notice, years of lift have already leaked. There is something even more frustrating than bad habits. It is the good habits that stop being optimal. In the early stage, pay off debt as fast as possible is solid advice. Debt is scary. Debt creates risk. Getting rid of it feels like progress you can measure. But once you reach the middle mile, some debt is cheap. A mortgage at a low fixed rate, for example, is not the same kind of problem as high-interest credit card debt. Paying it down aggressively might feel responsible, but the money you throw at it could be compounding somewhere else at a higher rate. This is not a trick. It is math, but the emotional weight of debt makes the math hard to see. So people keep paying down cheap debt for the relief, and they lose the lift their money could be generating elsewhere. And that relief is real. It is not irrational to want to be debt-free. But in the middle mile, you have to decide whether you are optimizing for emotional comfort or for lift. Sometimes they align. Sometimes they do not. And when they do not, the responsible instinct can work against the outcome it was supposed to produce. Asset location is another example. In the early stage, it does not matter where you hold which investments. Everything is small. The differences in account treatment barely register. But in the middle mile, it starts to matter a lot. Holding the wrong type of investment in the wrong type of account quietly costs you money every year. Not in a way you will see on any single statement, but in a way that compounds into real dollars over a decade. This is not something you need to become an expert on, but it is something you need to have set up correctly once. And most people in the middle mile have never touched it, because in the early stage, it did not matter. And then there is the income engine. In the early stage, saving more and earning more are almost interchangeable. If you cannot save more, you figure out how to earn more. If you cannot earn more, you tighten your budget. But in the middle mile, the income you are using to fund the portfolio becomes the single most valuable asset you have. Your career is not just a paycheck. It is the engine that feeds everything else. Protecting it, through skills, through reputation, through the kind of maintenance that keeps your earning power intact, is not optional anymore. If the income drops, the portfolio stops growing, and no amount of optimization on the investment side compensates for a broken engine on the income side. Neglecting the engine while obsessing over the portfolio is a middle-mile mistake. It feels like focus. It is actually risk. These are not obvious problems. They feel like responsibility. They feel like discipline. But in the middle mile, responsibility has to update, or it quietly works against you. Here is where a lot of financial content goes wrong. The temptation is to offer a dramatic fix. 5 steps to escape the plateau. One weird trick that makes the problem sound more exciting than it actually is. Some kind of breakthrough that turns a maintenance problem into a spectacle. But the plateau is not broken by hype. It is broken by small operating system changes that do not look dramatic at all. It is moving the excess cash to where it compounds, even if the difference feels small. It is routing spending through a system that surfaces leaks, so baseline creep becomes visible before it settles in. It is deciding once that cheap debt stays and expensive debt goes, then automating that decision so you are not remaking it emotionally every month. It is running the annual maintenance, checking cash drag, reviewing account placement, looking for avoidable friction, and taking the career protection steps that keep the income engine running. None of this is loud. None of this is inspirational, and that is exactly why it works. The most dangerous thing about the wealth plateau is that it feels stable. You are not going backward. You are not in crisis. Everything looks fine, and so the urgency to update never arrives. But the cost of staying on autopilot is not visible until it compounds. 1 year looks the same. 5 years, you notice the neighbor pulling ahead. 10 years, you realize you have been standing still while time passed. The people who escape the wealth plateau are not the ones who found the secret strategy. They are the ones who updated the ordinary rules. The ones who noticed that beginner mode was still running and quietly switched it off. It does not require a personality transplant. It does not require becoming someone you are not. It just requires recognizing that the middle mile is a different game than the starting line, and that the rules have to change once you get there. The neighbor with the boring car did not make one brilliant move. He made a series of boring updates, and over time, those boring updates turned into lift that autopilot never would have produced. So why does any of this matter? It is easy to get lost in the mechanics. Cash location, debt math, account efficiency. But the mechanics are not the point. The point is what the viewer is actually trying to buy with all of this. And the answer is not a number. The answer is less desperation. When you are at the bottom, everything is priced against you. Loans cost more. Insurance costs more. The system assumes you are a risk, and the premium shows up in every transaction. You pay more to cut your own money. You pay more to borrow someone else's. The gap between what you earn and what you keep is strained not just by habits, but by terms you had no power to negotiate. Desperation has a price, and the price is built into almost every financial product, every negotiation, every emergency. The person who cannot walk away pays more than the person who can. Getting past the plateau changes that. Not in a flashy way, not in a way where people suddenly bow to you, but in a quiet way, where the friction starts to ease. The emergency does not threaten everything anymore. The negotiation has a little more room. The deal that would have broken you a few years ago is now just a setback. The terms get better, the fees disappear, the options multiply, and none of it happens because you crossed some magic number. It happens because you stopped running the beginner operating system through the stretch where it no longer fits. And past that, there is something else. There is a point where the portfolio starts carrying part of your life. Not all of it, but enough to matter. Enough that the income engine is not the only thing keeping the household afloat. Enough that the asset base generates some of its own lift. That is when money stops feeling like a fragile collection of savings and starts feeling like a system. You are not constantly resetting to cash.
You are not starting over every time something breaks. The base is stable enough that growth compounds instead of getting absorbed. That point is not a fantasy number.
It is the reasonable destination that the first real balance was supposed to point toward, but the only way to reach it is to stop running beginner autopilot through the middle mile.
What you are trying to buy is not a status symbol. It is not an early retirement fantasy.
It is the transition from a life that is funded entirely by effort to a life that is partly funded by a system you have already built. That system does not build itself.
And it does not build on autopilot. It builds because someone decided, at some point, that the old rules had done their job, and it was time to update. Let us go back to the morning where this started. You opened your account. The number had crossed a line that was supposed to mean something. And for a moment, nothing felt different. That moment was real, but what it meant was not. That the milestone was fake. It meant you had reached the entrance to a different kind of problem. The middle mile. The place where beginner habits quietly stall the very progress they were designed to create. The win is not seeing a bigger number. The win is crossing the point where that number stops acting like a fragile beginner account and starts behaving like a system that can carry some of your life for you. That point does not arrive just because the balance got larger. It arrives when the rules finally catch up to the balance. The rules that got you here did their job. It is time to let them rest and update to what comes next. Tokens used, 14,263. Brief audit note. Confirmed the script stays calm, investigative, and case file in tone. Thesis stays centered on the middle mile trap, not beginner budgeting or raise relief. Removed one prohibited hype phrase from the critique of bad finance content. Soften tax-specific language so it does not drift into tax tutorial or loophole framing. Nick, just another story are not present, so no source dominance issue. Opening and ending bookend cleanly around the first real balance moment.